I picked up a really interesting comment from one of the comments on YouTube today from Ken McDermott. Says, thanks for an excellent summation of the variation in the respective translations of the Bible. Yet Martin Luther was more than a translator of the Bible, the Latin Bible, into vernacular German. Martin Luther, just like the newly elected Catholic Pope Leo XIV, the two of them are political leaders of their respective faiths. Luther sought to deliberately distance himself from the Catholic Church of his day, as Luther believed the church hierarchy had essentially lapsed and abandoned the underlying scriptural truth of the New Testament. Luther battled against the selling of indulgences, where the Catholic hierarchy were mass-producing worthless bits of paper guaranteeing the purchaser's sole entry into heaven. Hence, Luther became oriented against works that were based on your relative income level, as only the better off could finance their way into the good graces of the Catholic Church. The poor, left without their promise of salvation, in a competitive marketplace of buying one's redemption from a clearly corrupt system. So Luther tweaked the scriptural message to give hope to the poor through faith alone. Was Luther inspired? Was Luther God inspired in doing so? Well, just like the original fathers of the church were, yes, I believe so. Let's term it value adding, to use a modern day turn of phrase. I love the idea of value adding to explain Martin Luther's linguistic aberration in Romans 3:28, and his use of the word, his addition of the word align, alone. But if before getting on to Martin Luther, you look at the Greek word crisis or krisis, which means a judgment, a separation, or a decision. It denotes the point at which something must be distinguished, chosen, or discarded. We often cheapen the word crisis to mean a problem. It's not. It's actually a solution. In John's Gospel, for example, you've got the idea that this is the crisis. This is the moment that light has come into the world and men prefer darkness to light. The Reformation was such a moment, such a crisis. Not simply a theological revolt, but a linguistic and a spiritual crisis, a decision about what counted as true. And the verse in question, Romans 3:28, the verse in scrutiny, in Greek reads, Logizometha ga dikaiousti piste anthropon choris ergon nomu. In Latin, it would read, arbitramur enim justificari hominem per fidem sine operibus legis. As you see, there's no sola in that. But in 1522, in Martin Luther's German New Testament, he finishes the phrase with allein durch den Glauben, a word added, not a word found in Jerome, not a word found in Paul, a Reformation grenade, allein. Did Luther know that the word wasn't there? Of course he did. He writes in his open letter on translating, I also know that the word solum is not in the Greek or the Latin text. The papists didn't have to teach me that, it's a fact. But it conveys the sense of the text. If the translation is to be clear and accurate, it belongs there. So Luther justified allein as a good German, and more provocatively as true theology. It was interpretation rather than translation. He defends not the Greek, but what he believes the Greek means, what he believes St. Paul means, not what he actually writes. And this is a remarkable move. Luther is not translating words, he's translating meaning as he feels inspired to understand it. He sees Paul's exclusion of works not as an inclusive vision, faith plus grace plus mystery, but as a total negation, faith alone. Consider the form of Paul's argument, justified by faith apart from the works of the law. And this contrast suggests exclusivity. In logical terms, we might say if justification equals faith and not works, then justification is by faith alone. And indeed, the verse is surrounded by such reasoning. In Romans 4:2, if Abraham was justified by works, he has something to boast about, but not before God. And Romans 4:5, to him who does not work but believes, his faith is counted as righteousness. But is this exegesis or hermeneutics? In truth, As any honest scholar will concede, the two are rarely separable. As one thoughtful commentator has observed, two people with equal education and knowledge of biblical languages will often reach opposing conclusions while both claiming objectivity. And we all come to the text with hermeneutical lenses. Luther's were forged in the fire of pastoral despair and theological confrontation. That moment of crisis, that moment of crisis, that moment of inspiration, where he is where he's fortified by a solution. So if we take a step back, what gives Scripture authority? Why Romans and why not the Gospel of Thomas, for example? The answer lies in another crisis, the crisis of Canon in the 4th century. The early church had sifted texts through the filter of what they defined as orthodoxy, apostolic origin, and the consistency with the rule of faith. They had shifted the text that they accepted based on their statement of belief. Texts that failed these tests, the Gnostic Gospels, the apocryphal letters, the docetic fables, were rejected. The Council of Nicaea in 328, whose anniversary is coming up very fast, and those that followed were not just about Trinitarian dogma, they were about discerning which writings proclaimed the true Christ and which didn't. Scripture was not authoritative because it was ancient, it was included because it was believed to be true. In other words, inspiration preceded canonization. Antiquity does not confirm authenticity, just as for Luther, inspiration precedes translation. And interesting, Luther was not the first to say sola fide. Before him, the 1483 Nuremberg Bible, Nur durch den Glauben, the Italian Bibles, per sola fide, in Geneva in 1476 and in Venice in 1538. And the fathers, Augustine, Chrysostom, and even Ambrosiaster, wrote of justification by faith alone. Even Erasmus, Luther's great sparring partner, wrote that the word sola, though controversial in Luther's hands, had long existed reverently in the fathers. Luther's edition was more, however, than grammar. It was polemic. It was a response to the selling of indulgences, those Baroque IOUs from Purgatory, from Dante's Hell Part 2, the sequel. Luther's target was not just bad doctrine, but a corrupt economy of salvation that priced redemption in impoverished grace. And the rich could buy their way out of heaven, the poor were abandoned. That's not the genuine understanding of indulgence. The genuine understanding of indulgence is something which has quite rightly been revived, and indeed the Pope's blessing on the day of his elevation was followed by an indulgence, was accompanied by an indulgence to those who witnessed that and participated in his blessing. So Luther's line was a pastoral revolt based on his understanding and his inspiration, a reminder that salvation is not purchased but received, not earned but believed. So, is alone a literal translation? Absolutely not. Is it a faithful rendering of Paul's intention? Perhaps, probably not. Is it a faithful rendering of Luther's understanding? Absolutely. Is it a theological intervention? Absolutely. And that is the scandal and the brilliance of Luther's project. So in moments of crises, in moments of crisis, we must decide what matters. In Luther's case, what mattered was grace without price, faith without coin, and a gospel that spoke not to the powerful, but to the powerless. We reckon that a man is justified by faith apart from the works of the law. And whether that faith means faith alone is still being argued. But in the end, perhaps what Luther gave us was not so much a word, but a moment of decision, a crisis.